Let's move on to our other top story now. President Trump's cancellation of the planned summit with North Korea. The US president's called it a missed opportunity and a truly sad moment in history. He and Kim Jong-un had been due to meet in Singapore next month. Joining us for some reaction from Washington, D.C. is Olivia Enos, policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. Olivia, thanks for your time. What's the reaction in Washington then?
I think the reaction is definitely mixed right now, Tom. I think it's a good step in the sense that North Korea was attempting to set the terms for negotiation, and I think any smart U.S. negotiator would recognize that the U.S. needs to be setting the terms for the agenda and when we actually engage in dialogue. So I think this is a really, mixed moment because there was a lot of excitement, a lot of hype about the potential for engaging with North Korea. But at the end of the day, most people in Washington were skeptical about these talks being able to even deliver what the ultimate goal was, which was denuclearization and maybe even improvements on human rights track record.
You mentioned that the states need to sort of set the terms, and those terms were complete denuclearization, weren't they? Was that a bit too much, given the fact that we knew that Kim Jong-un was never going to do that?
Well, I think that the U.S.'s long-standing policy has been to call for complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear program. And I think that that does have to be sort of the starting point for those negotiations. And intermittently, North Korea, on their own definition of denuclearization, said that they might be willing to consider that. And they were certainly taking some positive steps. The release of the 3 Americans was a positive sign, as President Trump noted in his letter. Also, the blowing up of the nuclear plant that we saw, that's still on the table. Actually, that's pretty concerning because there are still American journalists, South Korean, and Chinese journalists that are over in North Korea right now. We just got the release of the 3 Americans. What if North Korea decides to hold some of those Americans hostage now?
I mean, that's a really interesting point, Olivia, isn't it? The timing from the president knowing that there are some of his own journalists, citizens and citizens of United Kingdom. One of our reporters is there indeed. That's an interesting piece of timing from him, isn't it?
It is definitely interesting, and hopefully all of those journalists are able to get out unharmed and not taken hostage. But I think it does, at the end of the day, make sense for the president to at least have reconsidered or made it possible that we might not move forward with the summit. One thing to note, though, is that at the end of the letter, President Trump didn't completely close the door to future talks with North Korea. He said, go ahead, give me a call. So maybe there's a possibility that we will have talks at some point in the future, but it looks like the door is closed on those June 12 talks.
Just while we're speaking to you, Olivia, just waiting to hear from the president, who we think is probably going to say something about North Korea at the White House fairly shortly. That's the Roosevelt Room, I think, or it looks also like it could be the Oval Office, not too sure. But when we hear from him, we'll bring him in. But until we do, Olivia, just talking about what the North Koreans might do now. I mean, the statement from the regime yesterday or early this morning about Mike Pence was very, very strong, threatening a nuclear showdown. And I know you said that the call, Mr. Trump said in his letter to call or write, but he also said our nuclear capability is much bigger than yours and we hope we don't have to use it. So this rhetoric of nuclear war, which is absolutely no laughing matter, is coming back in now, isn't it?
I think that's definitely a big concern, and I hope that the thought is not a return to threats of use of military force. I think that the best way forward would be for the U.S. to return to a policy of maximum pressure and this time actually commit to maximum pressure. I mean, up until now, the Trump administration has stopped short of sanctioning Chinese banks, for example, that are serving as conduits for money laundering for North Korea's nuclear and missile weapons program. And it's also only intermittently sanctioned individuals on human rights grounds. And beyond that, we haven't had full buy-in from the international community when it comes to instituting maximum pressure at the UN multilateral level. And so I think that the smartest move would be for the administration to return to that maximum pressure policy rather than resorting to these sort of military threats that we called for before. We know that our South Korean ally is not interested in having war on the peninsula, and that it could be potentially catastrophic for the millions of individuals who live in Seoul, just, a few miles from the North Korean border. So we have to make all of these decisions with our allies and partners in mind, not just South Korea, but Japan as well.
Yeah, how does the watching world react to some of the recent foreign policy decisions? A couple of weeks ago, it was potential peace on the Korean Peninsula, potential Nobel Peace Prize, pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. Now we've cancelled this summit. The foreign policy strategy of the Trump administration seems a bit scattergun, doesn't it?
I think that we're at this point where the U.S. is still in some ways defining what its foreign policy is going to look like. We have a new Secretary of State in place, and frankly, a lot of the signs from Secretary Pompeo seem to be really positive that he's going to be a really good negotiator for U.S. interests abroad. I think it'll be critical right now that the U.S. clearly communicate what the next steps are. Hopefully, we'll get that out of the president today when he makes his deeper explanation of why he decided to pull out of the summit. But as I said before, I think that by saying this, by pulling out of the summit, President Trump is now putting the ball in the U.S. court and making it so that we can define the terms for future negotiations with North Korea. Because at the end of the day, the U.S. should only engage in negotiations that it believes are going to advance and continue U.S. interests, which in this case includes advancing the interests of our allies in the Asian region. So having a really strong, stable policy in this next iteration of our policy toward North Korea is going to be absolutely critical.
Okay. Olivia Enos, thank you very much for your time.